Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar. The UNESCO chair at the United Nations University, UNU Merit in Maastricht, is organizing this series of webinars, and we're very happy to meet you today again and discuss a very important topic. Indeed, climate change represents one of the main challenges for humankind, and fighting it requires deep transformations in the productive system worldwide. The relationship between climate change, economics, public policies, promoting a green economy is a complex one. Climate change is harming economic activities through natural disasters, but at the same time, public policies promoting a green economy also can impact the growth capacity of the economy in a short term. And the energy transition itself requires substantial investments in infrastructure, changes in relative prices, and significant effects on the macroeconomy and on macroeconomic policies. And this is why we've invited a remarkable academic with an outstanding career and experience in various fields of our profession, Professor Andres Velasco. Let me say a few words. Andres is a well-known macroeconomist. He's a Chilean economist, professor in several universities from Columbia, Harvard, Yale, and several other places, who served, in addition to being an outstanding academic, who served as a Minister of Finance in the first government of President Bachelet from 2006 to 2010 in Chile. He was a presidential candidate afterwards, and is currently the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics since 2018. Andres has been publishing widely on macroeconomic issues, and we asked him to help our conversation and dialogue on the implications of the green transition for macroeconomic policies in emerging countries. And in addition to Andres, we have a discussant that we know very well in our circle, Professor Luc Soete. Luc was the rector of Maastricht University until 2016. And before that, he was the director and the founder of the UNU Merit, the United Nations Center working on technology and development and based in Maastricht. And before that, he started his studies a long time ago in England. He got his PhD from SPRU at the University of Sussex, and he's been pursuing different avenues related to what we know as innovation studies. So a number of expressions like technological gap trade theory, as well as all the theoretical backbone of what later allowed different authors to write about theories of endogenous growth in the Schumpeterian fashion, and the idea of general purpose technologies and catching up and windows of opportunities are all expressions related to his remarkable research work. And more recently, Luc has been writing very often on innovation and sustainability, on energy innovation, on climate technology. So we thought it could be a perfect discussion for today's webinar. So let me stop here and let me give the floor to Andres Velasco and thank him again for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am honored and delighted to be joining this this very distinguished group. Thank you, Carlo, for that overly generous introduction. Thank you, Luc, for sharing your thoughts on these very important points. I am not an energy expert. I am not an expert in the environment, but I am someone with a quarter century of experience in thinking about the macroeconomic challenges and dilemmas of so-called emerging markets. And what I want to do today is very simple. I want to ask, from the perspective of a middle-income nation, what does the energy transition look like? And there are many good things about it, but there are wrinkles, there are challenges, there are difficulties, there are trade-offs. A word or a phrase you will not be surprised to hear coming from an economist. And I want to spend some time thinking about those challenges, those difficulties, and those trade-offs. And so I'm going to share screen, if I may, but I need to be allowed to do that. And I'm going to show a PowerPoint.
Let me ask Leopoldo to...
Okay, I am now the co-host, I'm being told. Yep, there we go.
Good.
Can everyone see that? Wonderful. So this is the title, a somewhat pompous title for my talk today, The Macroeconomics of the Green Transition in Emerging Nations. I'll be saying a few things about developing countries in general, but maybe some of the emphasis, especially toward the end, will be on what you might call middle-income nations. But what I'm about to say is applicable to everybody outside the very rich countries in Europe, North America, and bits of East Asia. So here's a roadmap of my talk. First of all, we all agree that global warming is a big existential threat. I am not going to be questioning that at all. Secondly, we increasingly realize, and we have come to recognize, that limiting global warming, and I will take as a benchmark the standard limit of having global temperatures rise no more than 1.5 degrees, this is going to require a massive investment push. We need to build infrastructure, especially in those countries that don't have it. And those countries are typically either middle-income emerging nations or low-income nations. So if we accept that we need to do something, and we accept that the something has to be big, then two issues arise, or two families of issues arise. The first issue is one that has been talked about a fair bit, and that is, who will finance the investments? Will the financing be domestic or foreign? Will it be public or private money? Will it be loans that create debts? Or in the case of low-income countries, will it be grants? I will review the answers to some of those questions, but I have nothing of great novelty or interest to say about issue one. It's been talked about endlessly. There are many good reports out there. I myself have been a part of several groups that has issued reports. I will simply survey the landscape, but the novelty in my talk is not in issue one. The focus of what I want to say, and I do hope there's a bit of novelty here, is in issue two. Because it is one thing to say my country has now access to $2 billion, $5 billion, $10 billion, $50 billion of financing. It is something else to say that that money will produce the results we want the money to produce. We want the money to help development, but more to the point, we want the money to change the productive structure and the consumption structure of the country in question, to curtail emissions and to help with the green transition. But the macroeconomist within me wants to say, well, the macroeconomy is complicated. You increase something over here and you lose something over there. You spend more here and some price gets out of whack over there. And these general equilibrium effects can sometimes be surprising. They can sometimes be undesired or undesirable. And those trade-offs, I fear, have not been given the attention that they deserve. So just to get some numbers on the table here, there was a big report done by colleagues here at the LSE, at the Grantham Institute, led by Lord Nicholas Stern, a colleague at the LSE, and by the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And the headline of this report is that if we're going to have any hope whatsoever of meeting that ceiling of 1.5 degrees, then the world will need to invest an incremental, that is, in addition to what we invest already, we will have to invest about 1.3 trillion by 2025 and about 3.5 trillion by 2030. And this, of course, is investment in what broadly we might call green infrastructure, although I will add a bit of detail to that. This amounts to about, sort of back of the envelope, an additional investment of about 2% of GDP. So if you're a country that was investing 20% of GDP, that's your average sort of middle income country, well, you have to go to 22 or 23. And if you're a low income country where the infrastructure is particularly brown and where you have a long way to go in terms of greenery, well, it's not going to be 2 points of GDP, and maybe more like 4 or 5 points of GDP. And that's big money, right? That's increasing your investment by a quarter, maybe. It's a big challenge in many ways that I will discuss. And this table here is from the report. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to highlight that some of it is, the biggest ticket item here is on what you might call sustainable infrastructure, but there's also some money to be spent on human capital because, it's not enough to have the infrastructure. You need to be able to run it. Some of it must be spent on in a transition in the way we produce certain things, whether food, land use, or the way we preserve nature. And some of it is what experts call adaptation and resilience. If you put it all together, the additional target by 2030 is the 3.6 trillion plus the 5.8 trillion that's as a percentage of GDP, as you can see, 18.2% of GDP. That's a lot of money, right? And again, I am being a little vague here, but the report is very comprehensive. People who are interested can certainly go and dig up the details. Now, the first question, of course, is, will the money come from home? Will the money come from abroad? Some of it will have to come from domestic savings. The first reason, of course, is that the world will not give emerging and developing countries all the money they need. But the domestic savings will not be enough, especially in poor countries. For a purely and very simple humanitarian reason, higher savings means lower consumption. And if you're a poor country where consumption is at or near subsistence levels, you cannot simply tell people to save more and consume less. That is so obvious that it does not need saying, but sometimes obvious things need to be emphasized. But more substantively and intellectually, more interestingly, there's an efficiency issue, namely a clean environment or low emissions or an abatement of greenhouse gas emissions is a global public good. We all benefit from it, and therefore we should all contribute to pay for the necessary measures. So we cannot simply say, your little country, you pay for yourself. We all need to come together. And therefore, there's an economic case, there's an ethical case, and there is what you might call an efficiency case for global financing. I don't think this is very controversial. The next thing that is not very controversial is that we need both public and private capital. Certainly public monies from the World Bank or the multilateral development banks or the bilateral aid institutions should play a leading role, but there's no way that this money is going to be enough. I mean, we've just been talking about trillions, and let me remind you, just to provide some context, that in all of the pandemic, additional lending by the IMF was less than 100 billion. So how you go from less than 100 billion to trillions is far from clear. And, one way of finding your way out of that box is to say, well, clearly you need to mobilize private financing as well. But private financing will not be going to the riskier countries in the developing world unless you do what the experts like to call de-risking. You make that financing less dangerous, less volatile, the return less unpredictable from the point of view of the investor. And there's a massive literature on how you do this. And, local policies can help. Policies by the multilateral development banks guarantees, policy frameworks, and a million other things can also contribute. And again, this is not particularly controversial or new either. And this is also from the report by Stern and colleagues. And this gives you a very, very bird's eye view of where the money might come from. The yellow, the DRM is kind of an obscure acronym. DRM means domestic resource mobilization. That's the yellow, and that's a pretty big ticket item. Then the blue, the green, and the purple are international public money, whether concessional or non-concessional, bilateral or multilateral. And you will see that the blue, the green, and the purple are not the biggest. And then, of course, the orange is private. And private is fairly sizable, or at least it is hoped that private will be fairly sizable. But of course, the jury is still out. And last but not least, and this is implicit in the chart that I just showed, you know, for low-income countries, obviously, a lot of this has to be grants, because you cannot expect low-income countries to borrow and repay. It is probably not feasible from a financial point of view. It is also not necessarily fair from a more philosophical point of view. But there are two issues. The issue number one is whether concessional aid can be large enough. If you look at current ODA flows, they're not very large. That was in the previous slide. So a lingering question is, will there be enough concessional money? And there's much talk about this, but I don't think there's a firm answer. For middle-income countries, you know, I come from Chile, which is classed as an upper middle-income country. A debt component is inevitable. But of course, we all know that many countries, my country included, borrowed quite actively during the pandemic. So we go into this green transition with the largest stock of public debt in the emerging market world that we ever had. If you look at the most recent IMF fiscal monitor, it turns out that public debt is about 2/3 of GDP among the emerging market countries. Is that high or is that low? Well, it depends what you compare it with. The equivalent number for rich countries is about 130%. So compared to the rich countries, 65 is not very high. But compared to the history of emerging market economies, 65 is pretty high. And of course, emerging markets have much smaller governments. If you're a rich country like Sweden or France, you collect over 50% of GDP in taxes. If you're Guatemala, you collect less than 10% of GDP in taxes. So as a share of tax revenue, this debt is absolutely humongous. Bottom line, there's an outstanding issue still about who will provide the money and what vehicle that money will be delivered through. So these issues are fairly well understood. I would like to think, and I do think, that progress is being made in tackling all of these issues, in coming to some sort of a financing scheme. Maybe progress is slow, but I think progress is real, and we should all celebrate that. Now, there are other kinds of issues, and here I get into what I hope is a more novel portion of the talk. There are other kinds of issues which are much less discussed, they're much less well understood, unless you're a professional development macroeconomist. And I want to touch upon two of those issues in the next 15 minutes. There are many trade-offs, many difficulties, many wrinkles. One could probably teach a semester-long course on these difficulties, but in the next 15 minutes, let me just touch upon two of them. The first issue is what I'm going to call the capital inflow, current account deficit, and fear of sudden stop issue. And the second one, and I think the second one is maybe the most interesting one from an academic point of view, I'm going to call that the transfer problem and the real exchange rate appreciation problem or challenge. So the first one is the following. Oops, there we go. Let me just move this. There we go. So clearly, we concluded that the investment push has to be large. The investment push is going to require capital from abroad, public and private. And of course, and this is simply accounting, the kind of thing that we economists have drilled into our heads, if you have a larger capital account surplus because more capital is coming into your country, that means that you will be running a larger current account deficit. That's simply the definition of these categories that we economists have learned to love. And a larger current account deficit is, in non-technical language, just a bigger gap between what you are spending and what you are producing. Or alternatively, is the gap between what you're saving and what you're investing. If you're investing a lot in greenery, and if you're not paying for all of it with local resources, well, you're paying the remainder with foreign resources. And therefore, you must be running a current account surplus, and the other expression of that is that you're running a current account deficit. There's nothing wrong with a current account deficit, and sort of by definition, if you're a developing country, you should be running one. The problem is that it's very fun and very advisable and very convenient to run such a current account deficit as long as someone is willing to finance it. And what we know is that private capital flows are not necessarily the most stable, the most predictable, or the most reliable source of financing for that current account deficit. Public monies, we would like to think, are, if you agree with the IMF or the World Bank or the African Development Bank or your favorite bilateral donor, whether the UK or Sweden or any other rich countries, well, presumably that flow is going to be fairly steady. But will the private monies be steady? I don't know. What I do know is that in history, there have been massive inflows of private money into developing countries. And often those massive inflows have ended in disaster. They've ended in what economists call a sudden stop. This comes from the old expression, is not the speed that kills you, it's the sudden stop. When capital flows suddenly come to a stop, that's very painful. Why is it very painful? Because you were investing a lot, you were saving fairly little, that was a happy state of affairs, but the money from abroad is overnight not available anymore, and that means that you have to save a lot more, consume a lot less, and or invest a lot less. And that is not fun. It is not politically easy. It is the best way to get your government and your country into trouble. And if you go back and look at history, here is a picture from a class that I teach here at the London School of Economics. These are some current account reversals that were associated with financial crises in middle-income countries over the last 25 or 30 or 35 years. And you see that some of them were absolutely gigantic. The largest, of course, were in the late 90s in what is typically known as the Asian financial crisis. The current account reversal in a country like Malaysia was over 20 points of GDP. And in Thailand, it was of comparable magnitude. In Korea, it was 15 points of GDP. In Indonesia, during the same episode, it was about 7 points of GDP. My portion of the world, Latin America, also figures here. Argentina had a big crisis in 2002 when Argentina had to abandon so-called convertibility, when money stopped flowing overnight. And in Argentina, the current account reversal was 17 points of GDP. When Chilean banks went belly up in 81, 82, the current account reversal was nearly 8 points of GDP. When Mexico had the so-called tequila crisis in 94, which was also coupled with an insurrection in the south of Mexico, you'll remember Chiapas and Subcomandante Marcos, that involved a current account reversal of 6.5, nearly 7 points of GDP. Bottom line, when private capital stops coming, this simply wreaks havoc into your economy. Each one of these current account reversals was accompanied by a major debt crisis, a major banking crisis, a major growth and unemployment crisis. And therefore, emerging market economies, middle-income economies, call them what you wish, have a history of being traumatized by such episodes. And those episodes are not simply ancient, they're also quite recent. This is the current account of the countries of Latin America during the pandemic. And what you see is that in every single country but one, in 2019, there were deficits, some fairly large deficits. My own country, Chile, was running a deficit of, 5.2% of GDP. Other countries like Brazil were running also sizable deficits. Colombia was running a sizable deficit. Come the pandemic, every single one of these deficits had to be reduced massively. And in some countries, like Mexico, you went from a deficit to a surplus. So the idea that at times of stress, you have a current account reversal is not only an idea of the 70s or 80s or 90s, it is something we lived through 3 or 4 years ago. Granted, the pandemic was unusual, consumption fell because of lockdowns, maybe you wanted to consume, but you couldn't because a local restaurant was closed. Granted, the pandemic was unique in many respects, but still, there was trouble there, and the trouble is recent, and that also left governments with a pretty bitter taste in their mouths. Bottom line, therefore, is that emerging market economies are likely to be concerned about what they might view as excessively large current account deficits, particularly if those deficits are financed by private debt inflows. And we concluded earlier that some of the financing necessarily will have to be from private sources. So this means that if you're the Minister of Finance in one of these countries, you will be eager to place a ceiling on how much investing you are going to do, whether green, brown, of any other color, simply because history tells you, be careful. And particularly be careful when the money is private, and be even more careful when the money is private and it is a debt-creating flow. So we need to think hard if we want the investment boom to be large, and it should be large. From a climate point of view, it has to be large. We need to think much harder about how it is that we make these capital flows from the private sector more secure, more long-term, more reliable. Maybe they should not be loans, maybe they should be equity. Equity is not entirely reliable, but it is somewhat less volatile than debt. But even equity prices fluctuate, and equity holders get out. Equity losses are incurred when fire sales happen. Equity is not a panacea, but some formula needs to be designed, because otherwise, let me tell you, I have been a finance minister in an emerging market economy. There's going to be a lot of skepticism about these kinds of deficits and these kinds of investments. And that skepticism is based on history. History has been painful, and those traumas are not easily forgotten. The other issue, and this is the last issue that I want to discuss, the other issue is that having agreed that the investment push requires a big capital inflow, the macroeconomist in me knows that that big capital inflow is likely to have a counterpart in what an economist would call a big appreciation of the real exchange rate. In English, that means that goods produced at home will become more expensive relative to the goods that we buy from overseas. Or in jargon, non-traded goods, things like haircuts and shopping malls, will become more expensive relative to traded goods, things like shoes and food. Now, the real exchange rate in emerging market economies moves all over the place, so having an appreciation is not the end of the world. In fact, as countries develop and get richer, typically the exchange rate tends to appreciate. But it is one thing to have a slow, gradual appreciation. It is something else to have a sudden and sharp appreciation. Because if that happens, the amount of green investment that can be done becomes less. And secondly, the appreciation has negative spillovers on non-traditional exporters, on the other people who you want to cherish and help, because they are creating jobs and they're helping the economy grow. And in case this sounds a little too abstract and too full of jargon, I thought I would provide examples. So let me invent, and this will take about 5 minutes and I will end. Let me invent two fictitious low-income countries. Oh, they don't really have to be low income. They could be middle income as well. And I imagine each one of them receives 1 billion in grants from abroad to finance green investment. I said 1 billion to make it simply, but if it's a larger country, it could be 10 billion or 15 billion. Nothing is riding on the particular number. My first country is called Heliopolis. And Heliopolis is a country which is emitting a lot of greenhouse gases because it has a lot of coal-fired plants. Now, Heliopolis, as the name suggests, is a sunny and pleasant land. And you have a lot of small settlements, no big cities. So if you're sunny and your population is nicely spread around the territory, you have a readily available alternative to coal-fired plants. That is to say, you can generate solar, and solar energy is much cheaper and much more efficient than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And, if you have a lot of human settlements all over the place, well, rooftop solar panels will go a long way. Small-scale solar parks will provide whatever the rooftop panel cannot provide. So if you're Heliopolis, you take the $1 billion, you buy a lot of panels. Most countries don't produce panels. These are made in the US and increasingly in China, although nowadays the US is fighting back. So you buy them from China, buy them from the US, doesn't really make a difference. If you have enough of them, if the 1 billion is enough, or maybe it needs to be 10 billion, then you add solar generating capacity. You announce proudly that the coal plants will be discontinued, and say by 2030, much of its electricity will be green. This is in some sense what Chile has done. So, Chile is not all sunny. The south of Chile is pretty cold and gray. But, there are many developing countries that are going this way. And if you have the money and you can buy the solar panels, and if you can install them fairly quickly, you can make a pretty fast transition. When I was a minister in government a few years back, 13, 14 years back, Chile produced 3% of power with solar. We're up to about 35% of all clean sources, and we will be primarily clean by 2030. Now, not every country is like Heliopolis. Consider an alternative country that I'm going to call Urbana. Urbana is, by contrast, densely populated. It is not necessarily very sunny. And most of its carbon emissions come from cars and buses that are perennially stuck in traffic in big cities, among them the capital city. So what Urbana needs to do to clean up its act, it needs to increase the use of public transport, get traffic moving, cut travel times. And that means that in the big cities, Urbana has to build bus lanes, tunnels, bridges, and that requires cement, and that requires engineers. Well, cement is not really tradable. It's too heavy. And engineers can be tradable, but most countries, tend to rely on their own. So if you're Urbana and you're given $1 billion from abroad, you're going to try to buy more engineers, try to buy more cement, but they're both in very inelastic supply. So what's going to happen? You're going to bid up the profits of the cement companies. You're going to bid up the wages of the engineers. But because the supply is very inelastic, not a lot of new infrastructure will get built. Toxic emissions will remain pretty much unchanged. The money will have gone to subsidize a few people in Urbana, but from the point of view of global warming, nothing much will have happened. This is not about corruption, guys. This is not about malfeasance. This is not about stupid government. It is simply about a certain structure of production such that the same $1 billion has a much less beneficial impact. So let's compare the two countries. Heliopolis spends mostly on non-tradables, things like cement and engineers. Urbana spends mostly on tradables. In Heliopolis, the real exchange rate does not appreciate, so you have good spillovers. Maybe having clean energy now will make it more likely that you can export, so your exporters will be happy. In Urbana, by contrast, you will get a real exchange rate appreciation. And the export sector will be absolutely furious because now, those engineers have become more expensive. Exporting other things is less profitable. So the spillovers are bad, not good. Heliopolis can drastically reduce emissions. It will be viewed as a success story. Urbana will fail to reduce emissions. It will be viewed as a failure from a green point of view. Last but not least, in Heliopolis, income distribution is unchanged or maybe improves a little bit as the poor live in a cleaner environment, and that means that they get sick less often, they are better off. In Urbana, by contrast, income distribution is likely to worsen because you're bidding up the return on the ownership of cement plant, you're bidding up the return on being an engineer, and cement plant owners and engineers are rich to begin with, you're making them richer, therefore the genie in Urbana is likely to become worse. So the same policy, the World Bank or some multilateral or bilateral donor says, you're a developing country, here's $1 billion, use it to invest in green infrastructure. The same policy, without any corruption, without any malfeasance, without any stupid government, produces a success story in one country and a complete failure in the other country. This is not new, of course. This is related to a very, very old debate about economics, which is most famous in its European version of the 1920s. This is a debate between John Maynard Keynes on the right up top and the Swedish economist Bertil Ohlin on the right bottom about what would happen with the Allied imposition that Germany paid reparations after the war. And Keynes worried about a kind of dilemma like the one we have just described for Urbana. Keynes said, look, if we force the Germans to pay a very big reparation for reasons that are complicated to explain, the terms of trade will turn against Germany. Germany will have difficulty making these payments. In the end, Keynes didn't use this language, the Allies would be killing the goose that could potentially lay some golden eggs. Urbana's troubles, as I've just described them, are a kind of transfer problem, but it's a transfer problem upside down. Urbana receives a payment from abroad, but the price of cement and engineering services at home rise so much that the country cannot build any additional tunnels or any additional bus lanes. So the foreign aid becomes self-defeating for reasons that have some similarity. They're not identical to the kinds of reasons that Keynes deployed and worried about beginning in 1929. So the trillion-dollar question is, are emerging and developing countries more like Urbana, the failure, or are they more like Heliopolis, the success? Granted, the examples that I've provided are exaggerated polar opposites. Most countries are somewhere in the middle, but within that continuum, if many emerging markets or developing countries are closer to Urbana, then maybe the capital transfers will be useless at best or dangerous at worst. Which is it? Should we worry? I think the answer is yes, we should. So, there are policy alternatives. Urbana can make itself more like Heliopolis. It can say, well, I'm going to clean up the big toxic mess in my cities, not simply by building more bus lanes, but by getting myself more electric buses. And I will rely not only on local engineers, but I'm going to give some working visas for foreign engineers. And this, yes, this will diminish the real appreciation problem. So you will get more greenery built. It will be good for the environment. But politically notice, doing that weakens the growth and jobs narrative that is central to the green transition. We are telling the world, rightly so, that the green transition is all about growth and all about jobs. But I have just argued that to get the job done in a country like Urbana, it has to be less about growth and less about local jobs. So imagine if you do exactly what you need to do to maximize the investment in green infrastructure in Urbana, you have to rely exclusively on foreign electric buses and foreign engineers. So this would be the campaign slogan for something like that. Support the green transition. It is a unique opportunity for firms and workers not from your country. Not a very sexy campaign slogan, not something that as a politician or as a national leader you want to be caught saying. So let me end by clarifying that I am not against green infrastructure. On the contrary, I'm very much for. It is indispensable, it is urgent, it must be done. And I also believe that there's a watertight case for having rich nations, via grants, via loans, via equity, having rich nations help middle-income nations and particularly low-income nations pay for this green investment. So I'm very much a believer in the standard line. However, if we're going to do this right, and if we're going to get the results we want to get, we have to understand that just as even the medicine can come with unwanted side effects, even the best green investment plan can have undesirable byproducts. And unless we begin first acknowledging these byproducts and secondly crafting policy to address them, unless we do that, the world will not get the green transition and will not get the emissions abatement the world so desperately needs. That's it from my side. Let me stop there. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andres. Really fascinating to hear about your thoughts, the undesirable byproducts, or even the best policies, which is a major challenge for all of us. So let me give the floor to Luc and get his reaction to this lecture by Andres. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Well, first of all, let me congratulate Andres, Professor Velasco, for a very insightful lecture here, highlighting the way in which similar aid or help or grant objectives can lead to very different outcomes. I think it was a very nice explanation, particularly the last examples, of course, with respect to lucky Heliopolis and unlucky Urbana put it in a very nice and concise way. I think that I'm not a great expert on developing countries and particularly emerging economies, I would like to transfer Andres's analysis within the framework of Europe, in the sense that indeed within even a common currency area, with hence quite elements of less macroeconomic concerns, given the common currency one has in that area, I believe very strongly that you could have exactly the same examples as you highlighted, Professor Velasco, between unlucky regions, countries possibly, and lucky countries and regions. And the reason why I would like to focus on this is, of course, because let's go a little bit further in the depth of the energy, as we would call it within the European context or within the US context or even the Chinese context, as a transformative challenge, a fundamental challenge in terms of transforming the current energy producing and energy consuming system. And again, by total accident, it happens that the locational aspects in terms of where energy is being produced in the shift from fossil fuels to renewables has, of course, a very strong locational feature to it. We have traditionally always have hydropower, which is located in very specific regions. For instance, in the region which I'm sitting in here, the Netherlands, quite understandably, there is very little hydropower production. Given the flatness of the country, it is pretty difficult. There have been some ideas of actually storing water underground and raising it up to the upper ground and then using the differences in terms of distance underground as a hydropower production unit, but clearly the costs, the investment costs, are far too enormous compared to what nature has given us in terms of valleys and mountains, and where indeed we can use the natural flow of water as a power engine. Mm-hmm. The fascinating part of this is that in the same way, there is a very strong locational difference in terms of renewable with respect to wind velocity. And as you know, we have witnessed, I think yesterday, the big meeting in Ostend between the Great Britain, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, in terms of discussing the way in which the North Sea, as a sea with relatively not deep waters, but not deep and as such ideal for the construction of wind farms. If we look at the outcome there, we can see that the locational areas of these countries, which happen to be the United Kingdom, France, or at least the northern part of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and a piece of northern Germany, are again ideal locations for capturing wind farm renewable energy. And again, this is fascinating because it has a very strong locational impact in terms of what it implies for industry and the industry location. You produce really hydrogen when you have a surplus of renewable energy. You can, of course, produce gray hydrogen, but I'm talking here about the production of green hydrogen. The ideal locations are locations where indeed you have a surplus of renewable energy, which you can't use because it occurs all at the same time. Well, at that time, precisely, you store it and you transform it in hydrogen. The interesting feature about this is that, hence, if I look again at my own region, the location of the heavy industry, which was initially linked to the location of coal mining, for instance, in this region of southern Limburg, or in the region of Poland or other areas, where you find that heavy industry, energy-intensive industry, was located nearby such access to fossil fuels. And this was, of course, the location also of the whole Ruhr area of the heavy industry in Germany, exactly as it is here in the Netherlands with respect to the energy coming today from renewables. So what you observe is that there is going to be a cost difference in terms of energy intensive industry between the seaside areas along the UK coast, along Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, northern Germany, as opposed to the landlocked areas within the other areas of Europe. And hence this cost difference, and this is where now comes in the similarities to some extent with what you were highlighting, but now more from a European perspective in terms of the way one is going to construct electricity grids to try to bring the hydrogen production on the seaside into the hinterland to provide these heavy industries with cheap renewable energy, but at a very high cost. And so let me now take the third element after hydropower, wind farms, and finally solar energy. You know, the difference between where I think you live now in London and where I live here in Maastricht and Sevilla is about 900 hours of sun a year as opposed to 4,000 hours of sun. Again, from a technological perspective, this means that in Sevilla or in Andalusia, one can produce compressed solar power, which allows you basically to use the solar power as a renewable energy source throughout the night, across the day. And hence you're no longer bound with day and night. Again, this provides an incredible advantage in terms of production of hydrogen, where you combine, again, the solar energy here, the renewable solar energy, with the decomposition of water into hydrogen and into air. So in this sense, again, the cost differences of regions which were typically peripheral in Europe, which could not industrialize because of the agglomeration effect of the heavy industries in northern or middle part of Europe, is being challenged. And hence you see that the same kind of transformation in a locational sense is becoming challenged. And you see now, this is why I find your story and the examples you gave of Lucky Heliopolis and Unlucky Urbana fascinating, is because you see the same discussion now within the multilateral governance structures of countries fighting for investing, such as Germany, investing in massive electricity grids, bringing wind renewable energy from the northern part of Germany to the southern Bavaria part and the other part where you have the current concentration of whatever heavy industries in terms of both steel, aluminium, motor car production, etc. Whereas you could easily argue that this is precisely where Europe, as a multilateral organization, should intervene and provide precisely that these intensive in the differences in energy intensive production with renewables, one should follow and one should actually induce industry to move and locate itself nearby the renewable energy production sites, i.e. seasides. The same what I mentioned about the North Sea is of course also valid for the Baltic Sea. Again, if you look at the cost of renewable energy production in the Baltic Sea or in the North Sea, with depths of the sea level never below or beyond 50 meters, you do have possibilities for relatively cheap production of wind farms in these particular areas. So this is for me the fascinating story. That is that the energy transformation from fossil fuels to renewables has the same locational aspects given by nature, so to say, as we had it before, but now within a very different context. And I would love to hear how you reflect on this, in the sense that, for instance, Ricardo Hausmann, of course, well known, he put this in terms that, if I may quote just from him, that fossil fuels had a unique feature. They are amazingly energetic per unit of volume and weight. This fact, combined with advances in transportation technologies in the 20th century, meant that the world became flat from an energy point of view. The absence of local energy sources was not an obstacle. Yet as the world weans itself of coal and oil, energy flatness will become a thing of the past. With the exception of nuclear power, all green sources of energy, sun, wind, hydro, and geothermal, are unevenly distributed and costly to transport. Even if firms insist on using fossil fuels together with carbon capture and storage, they will benefit from proximity to geological formations that can store carbon dioxide. And these are not ubiquitous. In a decarbonizing world, therefore, energy-intensive activities will again have to take place near specific locations, just as in the days of water wheels. Right. Now, this locational element brings in an additional element, which I would say is striking, and in which, in your story, it would possibly lead, in the case of the unlucky Urbana, people moving. Not just having the difficulty of attracting foreign engineers, but basically that people will leave those places because simply the climate change is not being taken place. The transformation is either too costly or is actually not taking place. And quite simply, even with the monies coming from wherever, either private or public, the effect will be migration. And the effect will be migration out of those places with enormous impacts, which will go way beyond the kind of macroeconomic impact you highlighted. So I think these are fascinating stories, and I think we should indeed, as you put it very neatly in terms of the transfer problem and the comparison with, of course, the after the First World War debate between Bertil Ohlin and John Maynard Keynes, we have similarly need for debates today in terms of what will be the ultimate adjustments in terms of this much more place-based transformation, taking into account these differences between regions across the globe, which of course are much more fundamental as the ones I described here within Europe. So thank you very much for this this presentation, which I think was really fascinating, and I look forward to further debating these issues, etc., with possible colleagues here at UNU Merit and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether there's any question from the audience on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn or streaming. I wonder whether Leopoldo or Mercedes can help in this regard. And if there's no question, we're already beyond the schedule, but let me try to use the last few minutes to ask you something that is very relevant to the chair that I'm leading here at the UNU Merit, which is a UNESCO chair focusing on science and technology policies for sustainable development in Latin America. So in this regard, you know, our current discussion on the energy transition and the macroeconomy, what do you think could be the implications for science and technology policies? What would be your take and your advice? Can I ask you, both of you?
Maybe I'll go first and I'll be brief. I want to begin by saying something about Luke's fascinating and very, very relevant points. And I'm delighted to hear you quoting Ricardo Hausmann, because not only is a good friend, but I'm a big admirer of the work that he's been doing. And I think Luke just provided a very good and useful way of framing an answer to your question, Carlo, because as long as the location of production was dictated by agglomerations, and those agglomerations are 100 or 150 or 200 years old, Latin America was in a bind. When I teach students about Latin American development, I always show them a Mercator projection of the world in which the size of nations is inflated or deflated by per capita GDP. And of course, North America and Europe look gigantic. South America looks pretty small, and Africa barely figures at all. And that means that from a GDP point of view, Latin America was in the wrong place, because we were very far away from where the production and the purchasing power was. And that was an accident of history, or maybe, as Luke suggested, it had to do with other features. You know, in the 19th century, woolen production was set up next to rivers because you needed a mill, right? So you had a lot of woolen production in the north of England, for instance, because there are a lot of rivers there, or in Massachusetts in the United States, because there are a lot of rivers there. But the world, as we have just heard it described, is a very different world. First of all, because Latin America has a lot of potentially very cheap energy, whether solar, wind, or water. And secondly, because we're likely to have a surplus. So that means two things. It means, first of all, that we can export some of it. You know, if green hydrogen really becomes, the technology becomes good enough, my country, Chile, could go from being the biggest exporter of copper in the world to maybe one of the top exporters of green hydrogen in the world. I mean, that could be a gigantic transition. But more to Luke's point, if in fact transporting green energy is never as convenient as transporting a gallon of gasoline is, and to use Hausmann's analogy, if the world is not quite as flat as it was before, say, 1975, then you have a big, big advantage if you're located next to the cheap energy. And I don't quite know where that is in Europe, but maybe it is not in the north of Germany or in Holland. Maybe it's in Bulgaria, or maybe it's in Croatia, or maybe it's in Sicily. I don't know. Could be in Sicily, or it could be, as you mentioned, in the south of Spain, because it's very sunny. But, you know, a very sunny country like Peru, or a very sunny country like Chile, which can produce lots of cheap energy, is a natural location for heavy industry, or maybe not so heavy industry, that requires cheap energy. So the potentials for development of these regions change dramatically. I mean, you know, if this is in fact the case, we're looking at a hugely different geographic location of production in the world. But, you know, having said that, one realizes right away that the challenge is, you know, the opportunity is huge, but the challenge is also huge. Because, you know, if Peru is very sunny and solar energy is plentiful in Peru, tick, that's something going for Peru. But then you have at least two other questions to tackle. One is technological. What other things will Peru want to produce there that take advantage of that cheap energy and which are not going to spoil the environment, and which is also tradable? You know, you want to, Peru's pretty far away from the rich markets. You want to produce something which requires a lot of cheap energy, on the one hand, which will not spoil the local environment. And last but not least, we can then put on a ship and send to China or to Germany or to the United States. So which is the subset of those goods? I don't know. Somebody has to, figure that out. And of course, and I will end here, the other challenge for a country like Peru or Chile is a governance challenge, because you can have lots of cheap energy, but if your rules of the game, your macroeconomy, your infrastructure is terrible, well, nobody will come do business there. So if Latin America always had plenty of reasons for getting its act together politically, we even have more reason now. But because if we do get our act together politically, then the potential economic payoff is much, much larger. Will it happen? Will it not? I have no idea, but I think we're looking at an opportunity like we have not seen in decades, maybe even in centuries.
Yeah. Let me add on my side, Carlo, and also trying to be brief, that you see there is what concerns me as somebody living and having done most research on the rich countryside is, of course, this whole movement towards technological sovereignty, strategic autonomy, particularly in the European context, vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the US. Because in this context, this is exactly the wrong policy. Because, and we go back now to the overall climate challenge at the global level, exactly as Professor Velasco highlighted how this was a global ethical challenge, etc., for all, involving both aid funds, grants, loans, etc., across the world. In the same way, if you look at the science and technology side, in terms of assisting, helping with the transformation and the technology transfer and the use of technologies, etc., this is also a global challenge. And I think any movement in terms of precisely focusing on protecting and on limiting the diffusion of these technologies globally is actually, for me, is a major challenge. And where I just finished writing a paper on the balance between open science and technological sovereignty, which is, as you know, in policy circles here in Europe is a heavy issue. That kind of balance, etc., has clearly to have to go in the direction of openness. Now, to come back further on one point, which also Andres Velasco made, I think that if you follow through these arguments, then you see that there are trends. I mean, typically, again, the European side with respect to global trade has always been one that the rare earth materials were not available in Europe, which is to some extent a crazy statement, because these rare earth materials are, of course, not that rare in the sense that you don't find them also in Sweden, in Spain, in different locations. It's just that these locations are, again, from an environmental perspective, would be too costly and are much cheaper in this typical international trade perspective, much cheaper to get them from Latin America or from other places in the world. That too, there is too a need for a shift in attention and focusing much more on the local, again, the local access to some of those rare earth materials and to see, which are essential for instance, for these wind turbines, etc. You know that they are heavily dependent on some of those rare earth materials. The same actually for solar energy, for batteries, etc. So in each of these areas, there is a need for research to substitute for these rare earth materials. And on the other hand, there is a need for focusing less on the international markets and more on the local environments in terms of accessing to these rare earth materials in an autonomous way. This is where I agree with the notion of strategic autonomy, that you focus less on a sort of post-colonial trend, which Europe has had in terms of extracting the raw materials across the world without looking at its own mining opportunities, because they are considered to be, from an environmental perspective, too costly.
One question from the chat, and then we conclude. And this is a policy related or a political economy kind of question, because we've been asked, rich countries may be convinced about future economic benefits of current investments in terms of green growth. But what happens in low-income countries? Many middle-income countries and low-income countries may be seen mainly as a cost. I mean, the investments in green technologies and energy transition may be seen mainly as costs and supporting workers abroad. So how do we develop a policy and the mechanism and institutional setup to make this possible in low-income countries as well? If you have a thought to share,
Yeah.
and then we conclude.
Thank you, Carlo. I don't think that developing countries are condemned to viewing green growth as somebody that happens to others. I think that is a misconception. It can certainly happen also to them, to us. And it is not so inconceivable that that should be the case because, you know, if you're going to build infrastructure, that's going to employ some people and that's going to create jobs and that's going to make your country more competitive. And, you know, it has lots of potential. And I think the conventional wisdom today, if you look at the discussions and sort of the international community, is that, yes, it is for everybody, including for developing countries, an investment, growth, and jobs story. I think it's mostly right. However, the contribution that I've tried to make today is to say that is mostly right, but mostly is not the same as entirely, wholly. There are trade-offs, and there are different kinds of stories for different kinds of countries. And what may be entirely beneficial for one country, you give them $1 billion and say, spend this on green infrastructure, can be not so beneficial to a different country, depending on the kind of investment, the kind of productive structure, you know, to use a little economics jargon here, on the elasticities of supply and demand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So having agreed on the big picture, this is a necessary story, and it is potentially a growth and job story. Now we have to dig a little deeper and ask the more difficult question: how do we make that the case for everybody? For countries like Urbana and countries like Heliopolis. And that will require two things. That will require designing and targeting international aid packages or investment packages more carefully. And I think we've only begun that task. And even more importantly, it will require designing local policies more carefully. It is not simply a matter of saying, give me the money, I will build that facility. What kind of facility, under what kind of financing, over what period of time, with what kinds of inputs, all of that matters. And if countries do it right, they can get it very right. But regrettably, if countries do it wrong, they can get it very wrong. And at this point, the world economy cannot afford countries getting it very wrong.
Luke, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just on the last question, also in the meeting chat, I think that indeed private investment could indeed become, as it is argued there, more stable. And you see there is this enormous movement on the auditing side to try to find new indicators with respect to environmental, social, and governance. You know, these ESG criteria which are being introduced in the auditing of firms, etc. For instance, if you take Moody's Analytics, they rank companies now and they provide assessments according to these enormous set of ESG criteria. Of course, there is a lot of greenwashing in there, but as you go further into the development of those indicators and the international acceptance of indicators, you can see that funding with an environmental part in it is becoming a criterion in terms of assessing the creditworthiness of banks, of financial operators, of companies itself. So I would tend to agree with the comment made from the person from Argentina that we might move into this international, say, accounting world, which takes now into account environmental output and impact of investments.
Thank you very much. I think we can conclude here. I'm very happy of the discussion we had and very grateful with the two speakers that helped us think and deepen a bit our thinking about these very relevant issues. I hope we can host similar dialogues in the future. Thank you very much, Andres Velasco. Thank you very much, Luc Soete. I hope to see you soon. And thank you very much to the audience. Bye-bye. Bye.